Off to a great start. I was muted. Hello, everyone. I am very grateful that you've tuned in to listen to us chat about Doxy-PEP, and I'm very, very grateful to the 5 people I can see in front of me who've agreed to be part of our panel to chat about Doxy-PEP. My name is Ben Vile. I work for the Love Tank. We're a not-for-profit, and we work to improve the health and well-being of underserved communities. Probably our most famous or banner project is Prepster. And I think the things we're going to be talking about today and the work we're doing in this area and everybody is doing in this area, I think is very much in the vein of Prepster and keeping the spirit of that alive. What I do at the Love Tank is I'm the coordinator of research and community knowledge generation. And over the past a few months now, I've been working and researching about this thing called Doxy-PEP. Spoiler alert, I will explain what that is now, although we will chat about that again in a second. Doxy-PEP is an STI prevention tool that involves taking a dose of an antibiotic after sex, usually sex without condoms, in order to prevent infection with bacterial STIs, probably most familiar to you, chlamydia, syphilis, and gonorrhea. I am really happy to say that to accompany this event, and obviously as a resource going forward, we do now have available at the Love Tank on our queerhealth.info website, not the Just Giving page, although I will come to that in a second, our guide to Doxy-PEP. This is, if you're here to learn about Doxy-PEP, I suggest you type this into your browser now, open it in a new tab, and then obviously click back here, please, because I'll miss you. But this is probably the exhaustive accompaniment to what we're going to chat about today. Obviously, today we're not going to be able to cover everything in great detail, but this guide that I put together alongside Will Nutlin from the Love Tank and with input from other people too, including Manik, who's on the panel today, is a more exhaustive guide to Doxy-PEP, how to use it, what it's for, where to acquire it, what the risks are, who it's effective in, what evidence we have, etc., etc. Any and all questions I hope that you have about Doxy-PEP should be answered there. And if they're not, I invite you to leave them as a comment on this event page now. We'll be able to see them if they're shown to us by Will, our behind-the-scenes producer. And we'll try and answer those. And any of them that are really pertinent and not included in the guide, obviously we'll try to update the guide to include. A note about comments: if you leave a comment here today, it will stay on the stream in perpetuity after the event. So just be mindful of that, because it may be held to your name forever. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel today. Just before I introduce them, or get them to introduce themselves, I should say they are a range of community members, people working in public health, people experimenting with public health. I've tried to get a broad spectrum of people to give us the broadest spectrum of perspectives on Doxy-PEP we can, including gratefully people who are perspectives from people who are using or want to use Doxy-PEP, which I hope will reflect some of the experiences of people who are watching today. So I'd like to start by asking Manik to introduce himself.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everyone. My name is Manik. I am a sexual health and HIV doctor in London and a researcher at UCL as well. And I have a real passion and interest for Doxy-PEP. So just delighted to be here.
And how about we go next to John Saunders?
Thanks, Ben. Good evening, everyone. I'm John Saunders. I'm a consultant in sexual health and HIV medicine, and I have been thinking about DPEP or Doxy-PEP from a number of different perspectives. I work for part of the week at the UK Health Security Agency in the kind of national HIV and STI department there. So thinking about DPEP from a public health perspective, what are the potential benefits and harms at population level? I'm a researcher at UCL working with Manik, so doing research around understanding who is using DPEP currently, who would like to use DPEP in the future, thinking about how we can use that information to help deliver better care, really. And then I still see patients at the Mortimer Market Centre as well, so seeing people who are using DPEP, advising them about the evidence base. And last but not least, I live with my husband in East London. I have personal experience of STI, so I have that kind of, interest from a personal perspective as well.
Thanks, John, and congratulations on being married. Now we'll hear from the other John.
Hi everybody, I'm John. I'm an assistant professor in nursing and health systems in University College Dublin in Ireland. But I spent the last 5 or 6 months in the United States of America on a Fulbright fellowship where I've been exploring different models of LGBTQI plus healthcare. So I've had some time, I spent some time at Strut in San Francisco, which is I think the largest prescriber and provider of Doxy-PEP in the US. So I'm looking forward to sharing some observations from there. And I'm also a member of ACT UP Dublin.
Thanks, John. And Eddie?
So I'm Eddie. I'm a sex worker and trans guy living in London. And I've been using Doxy-PEP for about 4 months.
Thanks, Eddie. And finally, definitely last, but definitely not least, Phil.
Saving the best for last. My name's Samba. I also work at the Love Tank alongside Ben. And I've been there coming up to 4 years. I'm also a researcher, and I guess I work within health promotion, primarily around queer men of color. So I'm interested to see how we're gonna basically implement Doxy-PEP amongst that community in particular.
Thanks, Phil. And Phil's going to give us some perspective later as somebody who might be interested in using Doxy-PEP but isn't currently. So that's everybody, and thanks again for being here. Just before we start properly, I'm just going to tell you the kinds of things we're going to cover in the next hour and 23 minutes, but we'll see if we get to an hour and 23 minutes. We might be wrapped up in 10. Probably not. The first thing we're going to do is a very broad introduction to Doxy-PEP, to understand what it is. Then we're going to chat about some experiences, community experiences of Doxy-PEP. Then move on to chatting about what kind of evidence there is for anyone who's interested in evidence, and that includes, who Doxy-PEP might be for, what the evidence base is there. Then we're going to chat about a really important topic, which is antimicrobial resistance. That might be something that you're tuned in here particularly to find out about, because it's most often the kind of the media coverage about Doxy-PEP chats about antimicrobial resistance, and so we'll answer some questions there. Then we'll talk about how Doxy is used, so kind of like prescribing guidelines, and what that might look like. And then we'll conclude by chatting about how to get hold of Doxy-PEP, depending on where you are. But most of you, I assume, will be tuning in from the UK, but if you're further afield, maybe there'll be some relevant information for you here as well. Again, I encourage you, if you've got specific questions, please leave them in the comments and we'll try and get to them. If we've already covered it and you missed it, I might just signpost you to go to the guide, which is again available on the website now. And just briefly before we start, we at the Love Tank, we are a not-for-profit. Everything we do is supported by generous funds from people like you who are watching today, and funding initiatives. So if you do have, if you have ever benefited from our work, or you are happy with the work that we're doing, or you want to support the work we're doing, there's a link just there to our live fundraiser at the moment, and it would mean the world if you could donate even £1. Would make a massive difference and help us keep putting out stuff like this for free, and all the dozens and dozens of events we're going to be doing over the next few years, make sure that those are free and accessible for people. So without further ado, I'm going to start with the Q&A. So I'll start with Manik, if that's okay. Manik, could you just very broadly explain to people what Doxy-PEP is?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ben. So doxycycline is an antibiotic. It's an antibiotic we've used to treat infections, including some sexually transmitted infections like chlamydia, for a number of years. And what recent studies have kind of shown is that actually taking doxycycline, so 200 milligrams of doxycycline after sex, or particularly condomless sex, can actually help prevent STIs, so chlamydia, syphilis, and gonorrhea. And so people take the doxycycline ideally within 24 hours of the sex, but it can be up to 72 hours, and that's what's been looked at in the studies. And we know that people have been using it here for quite a few years already.
Thanks, Manik. Actually, on that note, John Saunders, do you mind telling us a bit about what we know about who is currently using Doxy-PEP?
Yeah, so In the UK specifically, there have been a number of relatively small studies that have asked participants of those studies whether or not they're using antibiotics to try and prevent acquiring STIs. And some of those earlier studies didn't ask specifically what antibiotic, just are you using antibiotics? And it was only later on that we started to ask a bit more specifically which antibiotic and perhaps how you're using it and how you're acquiring it. And so pretty consistently across those studies, and they include mostly men who are cisgender, who identify as gay or bisexual, who are either attending sexual health services or have completed online surveys that are collecting information about sexual behaviour and service use, for example. Pretty consistently, about 1 in 10 HIV PrEP using gay and bisexual men report using antibiotics to prevent STIs. And it varies a little bit depending on whether you look at HIV positive men or whether you look at people who aren't using HIV PrEP. But yeah, around 1 in 10 is a good estimate.
And how long ago, how far back does that data go, John, just so we understand?
Yeah, it goes back several years. So I think one of the earliest studies was just 100 or so people who were attending one of the Dean Street clinics. I think that was reported 2019, 18, something like that, Manic. Yeah. And that was about 1 in 10. So 10 people about that reported using it. And then we have things like the PrEP user survey that Love Tank PrEP still were involved with, which were ran every year for a few years. I think the last one was 2020 or 2021. And we have some more recent data that we're collecting from people attending sexual health services such as the Mortimer Market. We've done an interim analysis, and again, that's about 1 in 10 people. That data was collected between about a year ago and now.
Thank you. And other John Gilmore, you've been in the States and seen DoxyPEP being prescribed. Could you give us a sense of who it's being prescribed to? And also perhaps you could just give us some background as to where DoxyPEP is being licensed for use.
Yeah, I suppose that's quite an important thing, that DoxyPEP isn't necessarily going to be licensed for use everywhere it's being used. It's an emerging kind of technology or treatment or prevention methodology. So so a lot of the places around the world where DoxyPEP is being used, it's part of research studies and trials, and people are getting involved, and thankfully there's more and more of that. So I was lucky. I was in San Francisco for 5 months. Lucky just to be there, full stop. But I spent quite a bit of time at Strut, which is a community-based, community-engaged sexual health, holistic sexual health organization run by the San Francisco AIDS Foundation, and the Magnet Sexual Health Clinic is there. So I think they're probably the largest prescribers of DoxyPEP in the US. And again, DoxyPEP is not available everywhere across the US. It is licensed for use within California, but even within California, the rates of usage are very different. And I think what I noticed in Strut, and I suppose this is an overall kind of observation around kind of clinical practice in the US, is that people weren't so risk averse as maybe clinicians I work with in Ireland and the UK. And I'm a clinician in Ireland, and I've been a clinician in the UK. And I think clinicians are very responsive in this field to the needs of who they're caring for. And the experience, and Strut was originally an organization which was set up for gay men for HIV prevention and HIV treatment, but has expanded out and now cares for people of all genders. And I think the approach I've seen there is that people sit down with their healthcare providers. It's also a nurse-led service, which I think is specific and particular to the way in which care is provided. People sit down with their clinicians and discuss what might be suitable for them. And I think that's, I think we saw this in the early days of HIV PrEP as well, where guidelines were so specific and so rigid, it ended up a lot of people who maybe should have been on PrEP didn't access PrEP because clinicians were unwilling to kind of make decisions. So hopefully we kind of come up with guidelines which are flexible enough to meet the needs of people who actually need it, and are aware of the risks or associated kind of side effects as well.
Thank you, John. Maybe this is a good moment to ask John S. What the current UK position is on DoxyPEP and what this state of affairs is there. I can see also we've had a question which might be able to be answered here about what sort of state of research in the UK about DoxyPEP.
Yeah, let me answer that first. I think Johnny asked if other clinics in the UK outside of London are taking part, and they are. So that last study I was talking about that we're still recruiting to, so these are any individual attending sexual health services, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, because there's very limited information currently about what proportion of people who are not gay or bisexual men are using DPEP, or whether they even know about it, or whether they would use it in the future. And so this study is asking anyone, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. And that is recruiting at some London clinics, but also some clinics across the east of England, particularly. So through the Cambridgeshire Community Sexual Health Services, which actually NHS Trust, which provides services across the east of England. So we will get some understanding about people who are attending services outside of London. The current UK position, so and this predates the findings from some of the studies that we'll talk about in a bit more detail later. So it's a couple of years ago that we published this. And this is a joint position statement between the British Association for Sexual Health and HIV, who are the national professional body who produce guidelines for sexual health clinicians, and the UK Health Security Agency. And I guess the bottom line for that is that we, in the position statement, don't recommend that clinicians prescribe it currently, but it recognises that people are using it, and that it's not sufficient just to, end the story there in a consultation, that people should be asking, are you using antibiotics in this way? And then exploring a little bit more about how you're using antibiotics, which antibiotics you're using, given some of the evidence that we found that about half of people who were using antibiotics were using something that wasn't doxycycline, for which there isn't any evidence to suggest it would work. So there is a more kind of a person-centered approach to saying, let's support people so they know what the evidence is, so they can come to some shared decision about what they want to do. But it doesn't go as far as what John was talking about in terms of California or San Francisco, to actually prescribe it to people. But we're in the process of revisiting the position statement, and events like tonight, and there are lots of other meetings that will be happening to try and get a broader consensus about what we think we should be doing.
Thanks, John. And that's maybe a good indication for people in the comments again to be leaving comments, because your comments could help inform what might come up as the next position statement from UK authorities. So just a subtle hint there. Maybe now we should hear from some people who are using or thinking about using DoxyPEP. Let's hear from the people. Eddie, if I can start with you, just wondering if you can tell us how long you've been using DoxyPEP for, and I guess the story of how you started and how you heard about it in the first place.
So I heard about it just from seeing someone comment about it on Twitter. I guess it was someone based in the US who was using it already, or was maybe being prescribed it, or knew about people who were being prescribed it. And this was just some random person saying, I think everyone should be doing this. And I'd heard of people using it, but I guess I had in my mind that it was similar to PrEP, that it would be kind of an everyday thing. And the first thing I thought of was the antimicrobial resistance, and just thought it sounded like a bad idea. And because it wasn't being prescribed here, and I hadn't heard anything else about it other than just other sex workers I knew sort of doing it off their own back. But then seeing that and seeing like some other things about it online, I kind of I basically just Googled it and then read some journals from the US which were talking about it. Yeah, so that was about 4 months ago, and I decided to start trying to do it then.
And what would you say was the sort of key thing that made you feel confident to start using at that point?
It was the reading about how effective it can be, and reading about the studies saying that the concerns about antimicrobial resistance for chlamydia are very low, and that it won't have too much impact on other STIs. That was sort of like the outcome of this study. So yeah, that kind of put my mind at ease about it.
Is there anything that you wish you'd had to hand?
I would have liked, I mean, I guess this is the point of this, but like a comprehensive guide about how to use it and when. I kind of picked it up from different sources, most of them US based. And yeah, I guess I was just kind of trying to work it out as I went along. I still have questions, I guess, about it in terms of like window periods and like, for example, if I sleep with someone who has an STI and then take Doxy, am I still protected against the next person I sleep with if it's within 3 hours or something like that? Like, am I going to still be able to pass it on? And there are things as well about only being able to take one dose within 24 hours, but you can spread that dose over 48 hours. You split it in half and things like that. So there's things that I didn't really know about, which I've picked up since I've started doing it. But yeah.
Eddie, we were having a number of questions coming in about sort of how to use Doxy. So maybe you can give us an indication of how you use it, when, how often, etc., and what dosing looks like.
So after I've had sex with someone, I take one dose. If I'm going to sleep with multiple people in a day, then I'll wait till the end of the day and take the dose. If I'm going to sleep with multiple people over 2 days, then I'll take half a dose at the end of the first day and half a dose at the end of the second day. Yeah, was that the whole question?
And a dose is a 200 milligram. It's 200 milligrams, so that's 2 100 pills.
Yeah, the capsules I have are 100 milligrams, so that's one tablet the first day and one second.
And what's your experience of using it been like?
Yeah, it's been good. I mean, I haven't had any STIs, but I guess that doesn't necessarily, like, maybe I wouldn't have anyway. So it's difficult to necessarily talk on that. Although I was contact traced and I was then completely negative, so like maybe that is something. I haven't had any bad side effects or anything like that either. So yeah, it's been positive.
Great. And Phil, let's hear from you. And sorry, just to reiterate for the people asking, yes, a dose is 200 milligrams taken between 24 hours, within 24 hours and no later than 72 hours after sex. Which means, if you had sex on Saturday and Sunday all day, you could take a dose, 200 milligram dose on Monday, and that would cover you and protect you for the sex that you've had over the weekend. Phil, you are somebody who has expressed a desire or maybe an interest in using Doxy. What do you see as the benefit of it? Why would you want to use it?
I think the benefit would be not getting STIs. I mean, simply. But I guess on a more personal level, like I've been in a relationship for a year, and we recently opened the relationship. And once that happened, I went, I think it was almost 3 years without an STI, and then we opened up the relationship, and then I immediately got one. So it's like my own kind of personal experience of why I'd want to try it. I think the things that have kind of stopped me from doing it is like I've struggled to find like clear information prior to, I guess, the stuff that we've put out recently. Like I was struggling to find like clear information on how it works and how it's done, because there's lots of stuff that kind of not contradict each other, but they're like slightly different pieces of information. I'm just like, what is the comprehensive, this is how it's done sort of thing? And I think that's been the thing that stopped me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's very, very useful. Maybe we can start to talk now about some of the evidence of DoxyPEP, I suppose, to chat about how well it works, who it works for, etc. So I suppose the very first broad question to ask, and I'll ask you, Manik, if that's okay, is how effective is DoxyPEP? What do we know about that?
Sure. So thinking about DoxyPEP, we've got 3 sort of big studies which we can look at and kind of get an idea of how effective it's been. So the first one was done in France a few years ago now, and then I think last year was where kind of everybody started to really think about it. It was this big study from America, so San Francisco and also Seattle, and then another one more recently, again from France. So these 3 studies all actually, generally speaking, when we think about chlamydia and syphilis, all have shown sort of similar effectiveness of the Doxy-PEP. So, sort of somewhere between kind of 70 and sort of nearly 90% effective in terms of reducing chlamydia and syphilis diagnosis. So essentially, in these studies, people were allocated to either use Doxy-PEP or not to use Doxy-PEP. And then they looked at the rates of chlamydia and syphilis and also gonorrhea between the 2 groups. And so that means that we can compare and get a good idea of how effective it is. So essentially, when it's 70% effective, that means there were 70% lower cases of syphilis in the group that had Doxy-PEP. So actually, for syphilis and chlamydia, really, really kind of similar results across the 3 studies, and showing quite a good effectiveness, or very good effectiveness, really. For gonorrhea, it's a little bit different, and that's because gonorrhea, as I'm sure probably a lot of people know, the antibiotic resistance is more common. So there's a sense that maybe it won't be as effective. But the 2 studies, more recent studies, which are kind of slightly bigger, so from San Francisco and Seattle, and also from France, showed, again, very similar, around 55% effectiveness in terms of reducing gonorrhea. The very first study looking at Doxy-PEP didn't show a difference in gonorrhea with Doxy-PEP, but that was slightly smaller than these 2 more recent ones. And actually, the thing that's very interesting is that there's lots of antibiotic resistant gonorrhea in France. So it's resistant to doxycycline. So actually, it did work in France to a similar degree as in America, where it's a bit lower, the rates of antibiotic resistance to doxycycline. So that's kind of the 3 big studies that we can draw on to show how effective it is.
Thanks, Manik. I have a question for John S. Yeah, we're receiving quite a few questions about sort of, I would say, non-standard uses of Doxy-PEP, i.e. Beyond the sort of accepted, take 200 milligrams within 24 hours, but before 72 hours is up. Could you please give us an insight into what the evidence says, if anything, about, firstly, Doxy-PREP, i.e. the idea that you could take doxycycline every day as a kind of pre-exposure prophylaxis, the way you might take HIV PrEP, and then also when it might be most effective to take your Doxy. So I use that example of, if you have sex over the weekend, you could take it on Monday. Is there evidence that tells us yet when is the best moment to take Doxy?
Well, these are really good, challenging questions, but so DPrEP, Doxy pre-exposure prophylaxis, there is, to my knowledge, 1 study looking at taking 100 milligrams of doxycycline every day. So like HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis, if you're taking a daily regimen. But the numbers of participants in that study, there aren't very many participants, really. So it's something like 30 participants. And so it wasn't powered, which is a kind of technical term in studies, to say how large a study you need in order to be statistically confident that something is shown to work or not. So it wasn't powered to show that it would work, but it did reduce the number of STIs in those who were taking doxycycline every day. But currently, there's really too little evidence, I would say, and this is reflected in some other documents. So, for example, the CDC, to say that we would recommend taking Doxy-PREP over Doxy-PEP, so post-exposure prophylaxis, where there is a much larger body of evidence here. However, there are some ongoing studies that are going to be looking at Doxy pre-exposure prophylaxis. The questions about splitting doses, to be honest, I've not heard about that as being a possible regimen. So John Gilmore might need to say about what the experience or what the recommendations are in San Francisco. So I don't know about whether splitting it 100 milligrams and then taking another 100 milligrams later, whether there is, I haven't seen any trial evidence to suggest that. Yeah,
Eddie, just before I come to you, I just want to say this is a good moment to remind everyone in the who's watching and everyone on our panel. This is an evolving area of research, which we know some things, and so when we are talking about things that we know work, that's where we know and can be confident there's clinical evidence. And when we start talking about things like Doxy-PEP, or for instance splitting doses, or when it's ideal to take doses, we don't necessarily have that evidence. So we're not saying no, there's no proof, and or no, it's unsafe. We just can't say with absolute certainty. And obviously, you know, for people who are interested in improving health and well-being of people, we want to make sure that when we give advice, it's backed up by evidence and certain. So that's just a little caveat in case people are feeling that certain responses are less concrete than others. There's a reason for that. Eddie, did you want to tell us about this splitting doses idea?
I did, but now you've said you don't want to give incorrect information. I'm
No.
gonna just add that caveat. So my friend from the US who was prescribed Doxy-PEP, obviously in the US, I was speaking to him about splitting the dose thing and about whether to take it, about the fact that you can only take it sort of one dose within 24 hours. And his doctor or whatever said that if you take it at the end of the first day, it can help prevent catching an STI on the second day. So sort of in advance. That's just the information he was given. I don't know whether that's true. But then in the same sense, I guess, if you split the dose, then the first tablet you take would protect you for the day you've just had, and then would also possibly protect a little bit for the day coming up. And then you take another dose at the end of the second day, so it's protecting you for the day as well. So I guess splitting it would make more sense if you base it on that. But yeah, the advice that a US doctor gave was that it protects a little bit in advance as well.
Thanks, Eddie. That's really important. And again, there's with areas like this, we don't know if there's a right or wrong. And I suppose that's the point. We can make clinicians can make their best clinical judgments based on their experience, but we don't have large-scale clinical trials to prove some of this stuff. John G, did you have anything to add about this?
Yeah, just from talking, I hadn't heard about splitting doses, but saw something about it. So I asked some of the nurse practitioners, and they don't advise. They advise taking a 200 milligram dose within 24 hours of your sexual contact or your last sexual contact. So if you happen to get lucky on a Friday and a Sunday, you take it on the Saturday and the Monday, or within those kind of periods. And that's kind of what they're, and I know, like, the reality is people's sex lives don't operate like that. You could be having sex for multiple hours across multiple days. But I suppose that's kind of what they're advising within that kind of last sexual contact.
Thanks, John. And just a reminder to everyone, we do have, just in case people are just tuning in, we do have now a sort of as exhaustive as possible guide that's accessible on the queerhealth.info website. It's at queerhealth.info/projects/DoxyPEP. And we do have a section there about Doxy-PEP that you can read if you didn't manage to catch the response about the idea of taking Doxy every day as a form of pre-exposure prophylaxis. John G, I'd like to come back to you and ask sort of, again, a clinical prescribing question, which is what groups or individuals might benefit from Doxy-PEP, do you think?
I'm laughing because I'm not actually a prescriber, but I could say it.
You've been around prescribers.
Yeah, so I think I'm avoiding that as best I can, despite now working in primary care. I think again, this is emerging knowledge. So I think, people who are having sex, if you're not having sex, probably don't need Doxy-PEP, to be honest, for STI prevention. But I think there's what we're seeing, and this is similar to research in HIV, similar to research in lots of different areas, we're seeing kind of hierarchies of interest groups. So I'm not saying that people who have frontal sex and have a vagina should not take Doxy-PEP, but what I'm saying is there's less effective evidence there on those groups because we usually do as much research in certain groups. But again, I suppose it's one of those challenges, and it's a challenge I'd flip back to kind of the people in the more statutory services and in clinical services is, we're in this space where we're maybe not prescribing, not giving access, but we're advising. It puts people sometimes in a bit of a vulnerable position because they're kind of trying to access medicines in different ways. So I think, by and large, have a chat with your clinician if you're thinking about this. And if your clinician is very negative about it, maybe find another clinician who's maybe more person-centered and willing to have a chat about what might work best for you. But unfortunately, it's still an area where sometimes you're going to have to bring some evidence to your clinician because it's not widely known everywhere.
Thanks, John G. John S., on this note about gender and inclusion in clinical trials, what do we know about who Doxy-PEP works for? Who's been included in clinical trials so far, and what have they been saying?
So the 3 studies that Manik outlined earlier are in people assigned male gender at birth, so predominantly cisgender, gay and bisexual men and trans women. I saw a question about whether people living with HIV were included. Yes. So in the Doxy-PEP study, there was a group who were HIV negative but taking PrEP, and there was a group who were living with HIV. And so there is data from a Doxy-PEP study that in fact was almost identical in terms of how effective it was across the 2 groups. So yes. And then there's a study in Kenya among cisgender women, which did not show any significant impact on reducing STIs. However, they presented, or the study group presented more findings from their research just last month at a big STI conference, where they looked at adherence. So did the people who were prescribed Doxy-PEP, were they taking Doxy-PEP? And they measured this through asking people, did you take it? But also through taking hair from their heads and analyzing the hair to see whether there was any doxycycline drug within the hair. And what they found was that, I forget the exact proportion, but it's something like 40, maybe 50% of people who were meant to be taking doxycycline didn't have any doxycycline at any time point in their hair. And so what it suggests is that Doxy-PEP probably would work. As John was saying, we don't have the study evidence to say it definitely works, but we know that doxycycline reaches the genital tract or the vaginal genital tract and gets to levels that would be sufficient and are kind of similar to what you would see within the rectum. And so from a kind of biological point of view, it should work if you can get the drug to where it needs to be. And that's about are people taking the drug in the first place.
Thanks, John. That was very clear, because actually I don't think that was a super straightforward point to make, and you made it very clearly, so thank you. Manik, just before we move on, because I'd like to actually move on to talking about acquiring Doxy-PEP, because we've had a lot of questions about that, so we'll move on to that section in a second. But Manik, is there anyone who absolutely shouldn't use Doxy-PEP?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important thing. I think the main group of people who shouldn't use doxycycline for any reason is people who are pregnant. You know, in that study that John mentioned, which was in cisgender women. Any women who's in that study was found to be pregnant was advised to stop. And that would be the case for any person who could get pregnant. And obviously, this is important because, you know, people are using doxycycline, for example, to prevent an STI because they're having condomless sex. And obviously, there is risk of pregnancy that goes alongside that for certain groups of people. So I think that's going to be the most important group of people. I think generally speaking, for people who are on other medications, doxycycline actually is pretty safe to take with pretty much all other medications. There are a few things that might interact with it. So generally speaking, you might need to space things out. But for example, for HIV medications, for PrEP, and it's totally safe to take together.
Thanks, Manik. And if you go to, again, queerhealth.info/project/Doxy-PEP, we actually do have a list of the very few medications that might contraindicate with doxycycline. Probably most common among that would be, and correct me if I'm wrong, you know, acne medications like Roaccutane, isoretinoin, I think that's how you say it, Please correct me if I'm wrong, Manik. Is that right? Yes.
Yeah.
So there's a list on the website that you can see there. We've had a question about, and it's a good question, about sometimes if you take Doxy, it can result in thrush. Actually, one of the reasons that if you take Doxy, it can result in thrush is it can affect the balance of bacteria in your body, the quote unquote good bacteria. And we'll come on to what to do about that. And how to sort of manage that in a minute when we talk about using DoxyPEP. But just before we move on to acquiring Doxy, are there alternatives to Doxy for this kind of STI prophylaxis? I'll ask John Saunders this. Is there an alternative?
So bottom line, at the moment, no. There's quite a long history of studies looking at the use of antibiotics to try and prevent sexually transmitted infection. So, stretching all the way back to the 1940s and since that time, they are not antibiotics that we would want to be using today. And so at the moment, the evidence base is only about using doxycycline. And I'm not aware of any, John might know of studies that might be planned looking at other antibiotics, but I'm not aware of any at the moment.
John, are there any other studies?
I'm not aware of any, and I think it's got to do with the doxycycline is a very specific type of antibiotic. We know a lot about it. We use it long term in lots of other groups of people, so we know so much about it that's why it's, I think, in lots of ways preferable. I just would say the other group of people not to take doxycycline is if you've had an allergic reaction, or you're allergic to doxycycline or another tetracycline, which is the group of antibiotics doxycycline comes from. Definitely don't take it, and definitely tell, well, if you're not getting prescribed it, but just be conscious of it. So just know if you had a reaction to an antibiotic before, find out what class it is and just be cautious.
Thanks, John. That's a really important point. Also a really important point that, one of the reasons doxycycline is a good candidate for PEP, STI PEP, is that, yes, it's well known about, it's fairly cheap, it has few interactions with other medications, and also, it's already being prescribed as prophylaxis for other infections, so Lyme's disease and, ironically enough, Weil's disease, which is my surname, and also obviously is prescribed for long-term use. If you're a teenager with acne, it's often the first thing the GP will prescribe to you to try and combat that. So we know that it can be taken for long periods of time and is already being prescribed in other circumstances. So let's move on to answering some important questions about how to get hold of Doxy. Maybe we can ask Eddie that question. Eddie, where do you get Doxy, and how much roughly does it cost you?
So you can get it from quite a range of websites. I always get it online. If you've been contact traced, then you can get it from Superdrug or Boots, and that's about £20 for the week course, which is essentially 7 doses if you're using it as DoxyPEP. There are a lot of other websites. I guess you've just put it up. They're all going to be part of the guide, because that way of doing it is quite expensive. There are much cheaper websites to get it. I think I put in. It's kind of pointless to say I spent about £30, but I can't remember how much I got with that for that. But it was quite a lot. So there are a lot of websites where you can get it.
Thanks, Eddie. Yeah, I have put together a list of some websites that in the past the Love Tank has conducted sort of independent testing on HIV PrEP acquired from these websites. And we found that the HIV generic PrEPs acquired from those websites were legitimate. So I'm just putting that there as a statement alongside the fact that those websites are also listed on the guide, queerhealth.info/project/DoxyPEP. And I've also broken down the price per dose and per tablet and per order. So hopefully you'll find that useful. Perhaps it's important that people know what the law says about buying doxycycline online. Manik, could you give us a sense of what the law says there?
Yeah, so Well, so I mean, technically all antibiotics, so they're kind of essentially kind of controlled medications, so need to be prescribed by someone who's allowed to prescribe it. So that could be a number of different healthcare professionals, and for that, then for someone to sell the antibiotics or dispense them, for it to be legal. So technically, it is these sort of online pharmacies that are selling it without a prescription, that is technically illegal. Now, in terms of how that's enforced, or how that is actually the how people actually check that, is very variable, as you can imagine. So I think right now that's how lots of people are acquiring their Doxy-PEP. I think we've had lots of experience for years about buying HIV PrEP online, and this is a situation that potentially will evolve and change in the near future. But I think the guide and clinicians will signpost people appropriately, and I don't think. So this is a personal view. I wouldn't be concerned about the antibiotics that you are buying online.
Thanks, Manik. I would like to add that the guide also contains some important information about when you do, obviously, if you aren't getting it from a prescriber, you might be concerned, how do I know my Doxy is real? So there is some information there about how to make sure the Doxy that you have is safe to use. For instance, check that it's within this expiry date, check that the package hasn't been tampered with. There are lots of things that point to the fact that the generic Doxy sold online is probably legitimate. The good news is that Doxy is cheap, which means it's less likely to be sort of fake. The more expensive something is, the more likely is that somebody is going to make a fake substance and sell it to you. I should also say that on an individual level, because of the class of substance and the class of drug that doxycycline is, it is legal to import doxycycline, up to 30 days worth of doxycycline for personal use. That's legal. If you intend to distribute that to someone else, or you do give it to someone else, that's when it stops being legal. So that's just, again, that caveat is on the guide for you to understand. So maybe let's talk about some considerations about using Doxy. We'll zoom in on some of the specifics there. John G, how often can you use doxycycline? Is there a limit to it?
From what I've seen, people aren't given limits. Depends on how much sex you're having. I think there are lots of kind of ways in which healthcare providers approach this, and there's lots of different perspectives in healthcare providers. Lots of people who work in sexual health say go at it, have as much sex as you're wanting to have, as long as you're happy with it and it's fulfilling you. Others may have a different perspective, and I think that's all about that human interaction with a healthcare provider. But I think what's really important when we're talking about it is that we are continuing to go and get tested regularly. First of all, to monitor other potential STI exposures, but also just to make sure you are on a regime that's working, it's working for you. So this shouldn't be about replacing sexual health visits or sexual health testing through online services. It's just about a little bit of peace of mind. So hopefully when you do go, you get that nice all clear.
Thanks, John. And there is a link now on the screen. If you're based in London, that's where you can get a free at-home STI testing kit, a brilliant resource and something you could use if you wanted to. John S. and Manik, I suppose. Is there anything that other considerations people need to know when they're using Doxy-PEP, for instance, things about side effects or other things they might take to supplement while they're using?
So I think side effects is an important thing to think about. So I think most commonly with doxycycline, and this goes for whatever reason someone's using it, it can cause a bit of stomach upset, so some nausea, reflux, of diarrhea. Sometimes people can get these symptoms. Okay, and So actually, whenever we prescribe doxycycline, we always advise people you should take it with a big glass of water. You should stay standing up afterwards. Don't sort of take it and lie straight down. And that can help sort of minimize and alleviate the risk of getting these kind of stomach upset side effects. And I think it's quite important because so, for example, things like Gaviscons and these antacids, actually, you can't take them at the same time as doxycycline. So it's just really important to be mindful. Now, people, if you're using it, how frequently, less frequently, if you're not taking it every single day, then actually the chances of the side effects might be different depending on how frequently you're using it. So actually, if you're using it more frequently, stomach upset might be more common or more likely to happen. And in terms of sort of John mentioned about kind of allergies. So sometimes people do, for example, develop a rash, and so actually that's something. If you do get something like a rash, then you should stop and you should come and see someone about it. So come and see us in a sexual health clinic or a GP or see. So actually that's not a kind of side effect that we would say, oh, actually that's okay, keep going. So I just want to make that point clear. John, do you have anything to add on that point?
I think generally it's well tolerated and safe. There are some very rare side effects or issues that you can get with doxycycline, but they're incredibly uncommon. And for the most part, people who took part in the studies that Malik talked about, very few had to discontinue because of intolerance or unable to take doxy.
Thank you. I'm going to do some rapid fire things now because we've had a number of comments and they're all really valuable and good. The first is Craig made the point that if I haven't eaten before Doxy-PEP, I feel sick for the rest of the day, which to supplement what Manik was saying about taking a big glass of water, it's sometimes recommended that you do take Doxy with food because that can help avoid stomach upset. Also had a question from KS. How about hypersensitivity of skin towards sunlight? How common is that as a side effect? John G, I can see you nodding your head. Would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I think it's a side effect of doxycycline we know of. We know of this from people who have treatment of infections. So just, be careful with the sun, boys, in general. Like, everyone just be careful with the sun. Like, use sunscreen, please. Thank you. Remember that song?
Thank you. It's a good reminder. Let's all use SPF. Even if you're indoors. Even if you're indoors, you should use SPF, or you could if you want to. We've had a number of comments about sort of gut health. And I wonder, Manik, what do we know about the effect of Doxy on gut health, the gut microbiome? Is there any evidence here?
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing that a lot of people, who are using it, think of using it, worry about. And so from the studies that we've had so far, I think that we don't really have a good idea about kind of what the long-term impacts on your kind of gut microbiome. So that's the bacteria that normally live in your gut. And we know that antibiotics generally speaking can kind of affect and change your gut microbiome, and we know that your gut microbiome can affect your general health. It can be associated with diabetes, with some autoimmune conditions, mental health issues as well. So I think this is a space that there will be hopefully more research going into it, because I think this is a really important piece of information that that I as a doctor want to be able to share with people who are using it, and I'm sure everyone who is thinking about it wants to kind of have that reassurance, or at least an understanding of what that impact might be. So right now, short answer is we don't really know. And there's lots of things out there, like probiotics and things that can be good for your gut health, and certainly all of those are an added benefit. But in terms of doxycycline, I think we're still waiting to get more data, really.
Thanks, Manik. Eddie, how have you found? You said you didn't have any side effects. Have you had any stomach problems while using Doxy?
Yeah, no, I've been absolutely fine. I guess for me, when I'm taking it, it would normally be at the end of the day, and then I just go to bed. So maybe I haven't noticed for that reason, but I haven't had any side effects at all.
That's very good news. Yeah, and I would like to reiterate what Manik was sort of suggesting about probiotics. They're probably not a panacea here, but they certainly could help if you're using DoxyPEP. It's actually, as far as I understand, lots of times when people with vaginas are prescribed doxycycline, they can, or not lots of times, but sometimes they can develop yeast infections, and it is recommended that people with vaginas use probiotics whilst taking doxycycline to try and combat that, because if you get the yeast infection is a product of, again, that good bacteria, the balance being affected there. I would like to move on to talking about something very important that has been signposted very early on in this discussion, which is antimicrobial resistance. We've had a question from JJ about a concern that they have about taking doxycycline and how that might, if they take doxycycline, they're concerned that it might be less effective for them in the future. I think this might be, if I can say gently, JJ, a slight misunderstanding about what antimicrobial resistance is and what the concern is here. And I wonder if Manik, who is probably the resident antimicrobial resistance nerd in this panel, to explain to us what antimicrobial resistance is and what the concern is.
Thanks, thanks, Ben.
It was a compliment.
Yes, no, it's right. So I was going to preface this by saying I'm by no means an expert in antibiotic resistance. So I'm going to put my hands up and say that first of all. But I think this is a conversation I definitely have with people who I come across using it because of their concerns. So I think the first thing is there's two kind of bits of the antibiotic resistance question that to think about. So it's the bugs that become resistant to the antibiotics, so not you as a person. So it's the bugs, and so we'll obviously worry about antibiotic resistance in sexually transmitted infections. But as someone said before, actually with doxycycline and gonorrhea, with doxycycline and chlamydia and syphilis, actually the chlamydia and syphilis don't tend to really develop resistance as far as we know. Gonorrhea, as I'm sure people do know, it does develop resistance to lots of different antibiotics, but we don't really use doxycycline to treat gonorrhea because of all the resistance. So in terms of the STIs, the antibiotic resistant concerns are maybe actually slightly less than for really other bacteria. So that'll be other bacteria that live on our skin, live in our throat, live in our gut, which sometimes can be totally safe, but actually sometimes those same bacteria can then actually cause quite severe infections, so skin infections, chest infections, and so actually it's probably those bacteria that we have more concerns about. But so far, actually, the data from the studies that we have, they don't really give us a clear indication about what that risk would be to put a number on it, and so I think the main things are if people are using Doxy-PEP at all, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get resistance to doxycycline in itself, just as you as an individual. And so actually, if you did get an STI, so if you say, for example, you did get diagnosed with chlamydia, it would be totally appropriate for you to actually have your chlamydia treated with doxycycline. Okay, so I think that's quite an important thing just to think about, because actually it might seem a bit counterintuitive if your doctor is giving you the same antibiotic that you were already taking to try and prevent it, but actually that might be totally fine, because actually it doesn't necessarily mean that you, just because you're using it, there will be resistance as well.
Thank you, Manik. I'd like to ask Phil and Eddie sort of experiential question. Is antimicrobial resistance something that you're thinking about in regards to DoxyPEP?
You can go first.
You go first.
Okay. It was definitely something I thought about at the beginning, and that was probably my main barrier to doing it, maybe aside from not having any knowledge about it. But after I looked into it and then found out at the same time that the advice or the information from the studies in the US were basically saying that it's not too much of a concern. I mean, I don't know who was funding those studies, but that was the advice, so I kind of accepted that. Yeah, so now I don't really think about it. I've kind of I took that as the advice, and that's what I'm doing.
Thanks, Eddie. How about you, Phil?
I think initially it was something that really did concern me, but actually it was actually from a conversation that you and I had, Ben, that kind of helped. And kind of interestingly, today I wasn't expecting to get it, but I actually got my hands on some Doxy today. So yeah.
Can you do a live unboxing video? I don't know if there was a lag or you're laughing at how bad that joke was. John S, I'm wondering, or John S and John G actually, how concerned should individuals be about antimicrobial resistance? Is this sort of something that individual people should be worried about? Or is this something that is more of a structural issue?
Okay, I'll kick off. I think antimicrobial resistance, or we say AMR for short, I think it's something we should all be worried about. It's a major issue for health globally. So the World Health Organization lists AMR as one of the top threats to health internationally. There are estimates about the numbers of deaths that are directly related to antimicrobial resistance, anywhere up to kind of 5 million or more deaths in 2019, I think, were attributable to antimicrobial resistance. So, and that's across a range of pathogens, a range of diseases, right? So there is a general sentiment that we should be really worried about AMR, because without antibiotics, we can't do chemotherapy, transplant, all sorts of things that we need antibiotics for. Now, how much would DPEP contribute to that issue? I don't know, and I don't think we will know from the studies. But it's clearly at the forefront of a lot of people's minds when thinking about weighing up the benefits and harms of DPEP. At an individual level, the studies that Manik outlined, there are signals perhaps that those who acquired gonorrhea within the studies and were taking doxycycline perhaps had a bit more doxycycline resistance within the gonorrhea, but there are so few infections within the studies that it's hard to really understand how much of an impact it has at an individual level. So possibly if you get gonorrhea and you're taking doxycycline, you are selecting more resistant gonorrhea, but we don't use doxycycline to treat gonorrhea. So, it's kind of, but there's the bystander effect, the other bacterium that we're carrying. You might get a chest infection with, an organism that becomes resistant to doxycycline. And we use doxycycline a lot for community-acquired pneumonias, for example. So it's definitely something that a lot of people are worried about. How much of an impact will it have at an individual level? I don't know. How much of an impact will it have at a population level? I don't know. But if you think about within the Doxy-PEP study, 25% of participants, I think, were taking 10 doses a month. So that's, and the amount that you need to treat one episode of chlamydia is the equivalent to 7 doses. Okay, so every month you're taking more than twice, or some people would be taking more than twice the amount of doxycycline they would need to treat an episode of chlamydia every month. But most people don't get chlamydia every month. So, we're trying to weigh up all these issues, and it's really very challenging.
Thanks, John. And actually, that reminds me of a good quote I saw from a clinician in an article I was reading about Doxy-PEP, and it's similar to what Jim is saying in the comments. The clinician was saying sometimes with the conversation about Doxy-PEP and antimicrobial resistance seems to present a sort of false dichotomy between sort of antibiotics and no antibiotics. And actually, we're talking about the difference between the use of antibiotics to prevent and the use of antibiotics to treat. Not the idea of using antibiotics to prevent and then no antibiotics. That's not what's happening here. John G, did you want to add anything about this sort of individual versus structural?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a structural issue, but obviously we're all part of that structure in society. And the biggest issue on microbial misuse of antimicrobials is probably not in the human industry. It's probably in agriculture. So I'm not a vegan. I'm not going to tell you all to be vegans, but I think that's something. So to be just conscious, and I suppose in good citizenship just to be aware that this is an issue for us. My focus now is in primary care, but most of my career I spent in the intensive care unit, where antibiotics are really, really important for me to give my care. And I have loads of experience of people who were multiple resistance, and we were trying really hard with consultant microbiologists and not being able to treat their infection. So it is, but it's an issue around sustainable development, it's an issue around agriculture, it's an issue around climate change, and it's an issue around kind of prescriptions and misprescriptions and all of those things as well. So I think that's something for us to be conscious of.
Thank you. I'm just going to signpost to everyone in the chat that we've been going for an hour and 5 minutes, and I am coming to the end of my questions. So if you've got any questions and you want them to be answered, ask them now, because we may wrap up before 7:30. My final question on antimicrobial resistance, I will ask to John, and Manik, which is, if Doxy-PEP were to be implemented, and this is obviously speculative, what kinds of things might be in place to sort of help allay concerns or monitor the situation regarding antimicrobial resistance? Is there anything sort of speculative? This is not me saying you're taking a firm position that this absolutely must be implemented, but the kinds of things that we might be starting to discuss.
Well, I can start at a kind of surveillance level. So there is a lot of national surveillance to look at antimicrobial resistance within infections that are diagnosed within England and the UK, and so that would continue. And particularly, we have very strong surveillance for sexually transmitted infections. All those kind of annual reports that you see published every year about how much gonorrhea there is, how much syphilis there is, the trends in the different infections, is all as a result of that very strong surveillance that we have. And we would continue to do that, and we could add in or strengthen surveillance to look at who is using DPEP to try and understand whether we're seeing emerging trends or patterns around antimicrobial resistance. So, and in fact, that is already something that we collect within our gonorrhea resistance to antimicrobial surveillance program. So at a kind of national level, we could kind of look at that and try and untangle trends or pictures that we're seeing if and as they develop.
Thank you, John. Anyone else want to?
Yeah, I think that's super important. I think as well, just from a kind of in the response and kind of, there's two things I think about. First of all, is like proper education and health promotion. Like, I mean, I love everything the Love Tank does. I'm not in the UK usually, but I have all the t-shirts, and I think it's about resourcing that, because what I fear about is people hear about Doxy-PEP and they just go up to Granny's cupboard and take out all the drugs that are there and start thinking like they start taking amoxicillin, they start taking erythromycin, start taking about some wild and wonderful drugs because Granny had a crazy UTI. We don't want that point, and that's why I think there is something around clinicians stepping up to say, okay, if people are doing this, we need to support them to do it right and access the medication, the right medication, but also have the clinical services there, because not everybody needs Doxy-PEP. Like, you know, there are some people who definitely do, and that's not always got to do with the amount of sex you're having. There are some poor characters who they have sex, you know, just on their birthday, and they always end up getting, you know, chlamydia from it. And maybe that's a good person to say, take 200 milligrams after your birthday sex. Or there's some people who have loads of sex and don't tend to have as many STIs. So maybe that's more of monitoring. So I think having good services where people can access, where people trust their clinicians they're engaging with. And that was one of my observations in the US, and looking at a nurse-led service like Strut, where people really liked the people they were engaging with. They didn't ever feel like they were being spoken down to or instructed. You know, they were getting real person-centered approaches to sexual health. And I'm not just saying that nurses are the only ones who can do that. I'm saying that but you know, we need to have clinicians who are willing to have real conversations with people around what might help them. But it's not that everyone should be on Doxy-PEP next week. And I think that's the case across the board with everything.
Thanks, John. And I'm going to use that as a nice segue to remind, and Eddie, I will come to you in a second, just to remind people that if you do want to support the work the Love Tank is doing on Doxy-PEP, you can donate to us on our Red Run donation page. Will, if you could put that link up, that would be great. And we do have that now guide available that we're going to hope to distribute more effectively and get to the people that need it, and obviously keep updated and live. Eddie, did you want to add something?
I just wanted to say that I feel like in terms of who should be prescribed it and who should be allowed to access it, I feel like it should be anyone who feels like they need it, because at the moment, those are the people who are going to be accessing it through the internet, where it's not monitored or anything, like the way people are doing it now. So if it's going to be happening in a clinical setting, it should be the same approach, but just at least monitored and at least prescribed more sort of officially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Eddie. Really good point. I'd like to sort of begin to approach some of the questions that people are asking, because I have one final question, and it dovetails really nicely with another question we've been asked, which is, I'm scrolling up to find it. It's the one about accessing, how can community sort of help to agitate for Doxy-PEP? So I turn that question to everybody who wants to answer that question. What can people who are watching do to, if they are interested in making Doxy-PEP available, what can they do to support this and advocate? Well, as Johnny said, there we go. How can community help to advocate for more trials and research? Thank you for writing that much more eloquently than I am currently speaking. Phil.
I think it kind of similarly to trying to get PrEP available on the NHS, it's also partially about the demand. I feel like if a lot more people that could benefit from taking Doxy-PEP knew about it, or like, you know, it kept coming up in like clinical settings, like asking their doctors and nurses about it, then they can see that there's a surge for people that really want it. And I think that's kind of similar to what happened with PrEP, and I think that's probably part of what could happen.
Yeah, I agree with that, Phil. And actually, on that note, you know, we have this resource now, queerhealth.info/project/Doxy-PEP. You know, word of mouth is really, really powerful. Peer education and supporting each other, you know, signposting this, sending this to your friends, just so they know. So the next time they hear the word Doxy-PEP, they'll know what it is, and they might be able to recommend it to people that they think might benefit from it and start conversations, etc. That's how fires catch, and that's how movements start, and that's how we make things happen, I think. Does anyone else want to add something to this? No? So we have another question about clinical trials. Are there any clinical trials in the UK currently about Doxy-PEP, people to get involved in?
I think that's a really, really good question. And I think that the sad answer is that right now in the UK, there's no sort of trials of using Doxy-PEP. And I think this is, you know, a bit of a shame. And I think that, you know, we do need more studies to happen for using Doxy-PEP in lots of different groups of people. And also in different contexts, because actually, because of differences in antibiotic resistance in different countries, actually, it's going to be important to understand, will it work everywhere, actually? And I think, you know, it's going to take a lot more research to understand what these risks are in terms of antibiotic resistance, the effects on people's guts and their microbiome, and this is something that, you know, I desperately want more of to be happening here. And I think, you know, it's so important, I think, that actually the research we do is actually reflects what our patients, what members of the community want, and I think this is very clear to me anyway, that, you know, these, you know, concerns that people raise or the thoughts about using Doxy-PEP, you know, are really growing. It's really important, and we need to address that.
Yeah, thank you. And we had an important question which has already been answered, but I just want to reiterate. It was a question: can you summarize the dosage? Is it a one-off 200 milligrams just once within the 72-hour window? And very kindly, Rodney Perkins has summarized that. Yes, 200 milligrams within the 72 hours, but you want to take it as close to the last sexual encounter as possible. And again, if you want to have this to hand on reference, you want the bookmark, it's queerhealth.info/project/Doxy-PEP. I do feel like I'm on QVC, but I love it. We are coming to the end, and I think there's only one more question that I'd like to pose to everyone. It's actually moving away from DoxyPEP, which is we've signposted that DoxyPEP might not be a perfect solution to, for instance, gonorrhea. So yes, can anyone point us to any points of sunlight on the horizon with regards to STI prevention tools that might not just be DoxyPEP or indeed condoms, which are obviously that have been the mainstay of STI prevention for a while now?
Well, as Benjamin puts here, Bexsero is something that people are very interested in. So Bexsero is a vaccine against Neisseria meningitidis. So this is a bacterium that causes meningitis. It's very closely related to the bacterium that causes gonorrhea, which is called Neisseria gonorrhea. Okay, so they have very similar names because they're very similar bacteria. And what was noticed in some settings in some countries was that among people who had received the vaccine for Neisseria meningitidis, some of the strains of that, that they seem to have less gonorrhea. And so that kind of spurred a lot of interest in this area, and there are a number of trials that are ongoing. And in fact, one of the studies that Manik mentioned earlier around Doxy-PEP, called the Doxy-VAX study, which was conducted in France, was not only looking at the impact of doxycycline on STIs, but a group within the study were also receiving Bexsero, the vaccine, to see what impact that had on gonorrhea. And it did have an impact on gonorrhea. I think, Manik, was it 50% reduction?
Yes, but I think much more recent analysis is potentially downplaying how effective it was. So I think we need to really wait to find out actually about the Bexsero vaccine in that study. So I think the jury's still out on that one for the study anyway. But I mean, I think one of the things about DoxyPEP is actually, there's lots of research going on into not just Bexsero, but other vaccines for gonorrhea, vaccines for syphilis, vaccines for chlamydia. And so, it's conceivable that this is something which people use for a period of time. And actually, once we have vaccines, effective vaccines for these infections, then actually the need for DoxyPEP will also, go down in the future potentially.
Thanks, Manik. We had one final question on this note, which is there any information about how to take part in clinical trials about vaccines that you can signpost to? It's okay if the answer is no.
Yes, well, just there are studies happening in the gonorrhea of new, for example, gonorrhea vaccines, so if you follow the our research team's page, if there's information about the vaccine coming, about recruitment of studies, I can share that. It will be shared on that page. So I don't know if that's something I can. Maybe I'll put that in the chat about following that page.
Yeah, thank you. And then we can have that pinned to the screen. Well, that is everything from me. I think we've answered all the questions that were asked, and everybody did a fantastic job. I want to thank you all so much for your clarity and for sharing so generously. And once again, I'm just going to signpost the guide on the screen. It's queerhealth.info/projects/DoxyPEP. Please have a read of this. If you have any feedback, whether that be I loved it or this was missing, please feel free to email me at research@prepster.info. That's research@prepster.info. And a final signposting that Manik's put in the chat, the social media handles of his team, where you might find out more about upcoming trials for, e.g., gonorrhea vaccination. So thanks everybody for attending. Thanks to our panelists. Yeah, good luck, Godspeed, and solidarity to everybody.